From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Bloomberg's Michael Shepard, I'm Kaylee Lyons. Tonight, a 90-day reprieve leads to a surge on Wall Street as the president lays the groundwork for what he says is a, quote, total reset with China.
We're not looking to hurt China. China was being hurt very badly. They were closing up factories. They were having a lot of unrest. And they were very happy to be able to do something with us.
The details on that trade war truce and the drug price action the White House announced today, all coming up ahead.
Plus, Congress unveils its long-awaited budget and tax plan as Republicans struggle to get the party to unite behind key points while trying to make that Memorial Day deadline. And the particulars of what was unveiled today and more when Republican Congressman Mike Lawler of New York joins us.
And as we get the first images of the last American hostage freed by Hamas today, President Trump heads to the Middle East and floats a detour to Turkey on Thursday for potential peace talks between Russia and Ukraine. We're joined by former Defense Secretary Leon Panetta for a look at what we can expect. But we begin tonight with a look at what we saw today. Markets reacting quite positively to the trade talks in Geneva, Switzerland this weekend between the U.S. and China, which saw tariffs brought lower. As a result, stocks went higher. And joining us now from worldwide headquarters in New York is Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick. And Romaine, we're now handily above the levels where we were just before Liberation Day on April 2nd.
Yeah, I mean, quite astonishing when you think about it. And you think about all the pessimism that was in this market in that first week of April. Remember, stocks effectively as a group hit a bottom right around April 8th. So just a few days after that April 2nd Liberation Day announcement. And you started to see bids come back in that really began to accelerate when it became clear that there was a potential here for a bit of a détente with some of our big trading partners. Of course, the big question mark was China, and we finally got progress on that over the weekend. And now Trump teasing the possibility for a call with Xi Jinping sometime this week. The S&P gaining more than 3%, the NASDAQ composite up 4%, the Philadelphia Semiconductor Index gaining 7%. Similar gains you saw out there in Dow Transports, which includes a lot of those industrial companies as well as a lot of airlines. And effectively, you now have a market that has priced out the worst case scenarios and has taken us back to levels that we were at back, well, in late March, maybe early March, depending on the particular indice. But that doesn't mean we're completely out of the woods, Kaylee. There are a lot of people now just trying to figure out whether this rally is sustainable. I want you to put up just real quickly what we saw today in the drug and pharmaceutical space. President Trump today talked a lot about potentially bringing drug prices down, and we saw a rally in that space despite the fact that a lot of people said we should have seen a decline. But that optimism, once again, has to do more with that sort of easing of trade, of this trade war, or the potential easing of that trade war, and that provided a big lift for those stocks. But nowhere do we see as big of a lift than in the toy space, Kaylee, because, of course, when you look at names like Mattel and Hasbro, you're talking about companies that are heavily reliant on a Chinese supply chain, and the potential reprieve there put a big bid under those stocks. Mattel rallying 10% here on the day. The best day for that stock going all the way back to February of this year. Hasbro up 7%. But take a look at Funko. 46% gain on that stock. Biggest one-day gain. You know, those are little bobbleheads, Kaylee. One day you're going to be famous enough where you're going to get one of those bobbleheads as well. That stock getting a big turnaround from where it was just a few weeks ago.
Oh, well, I'd buy a Romaine Bostick bobblehead, that's for sure. Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick, thank you so much, joining us live from New York. And now we turn our focus to Capitol Hill. The House Ways and Means Committee just a few hours ago releasing its draft bill to enact President Trump's tax cut proposals. The draft, which will be marked up tomorrow, would eliminate taxes on tips and overtime pay through 2028, doesn't include a tax hike on the wealthiest Americans, and calls for increasing the state and local tax deduction to $30,000 for both individuals and couples with income limits. That's just a fraction of what SALT advocates in the House want. And for more, we turn now to one of them. Republican Congressman Mike Lawler of New York is here with us on Bloomberg TV and radio. Congressman, we appreciate the time. As it stands right now, is this package going to get your vote?
Look, as I said from the very beginning, that I would not support a tax bill that does not adequately address the unfair $10,000 cap that was put in place under the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. remember, when the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act expires at the end of this year, SALT comes back unlimited. And so in order for there to be a tax bill that would actually put a cap in place, it has to adequately address the concerns of my constituents. There are other provisions, obviously, that we want to make sure do not come back. For instance, the alternative minimum tax. And that's why we're willing to negotiate and have been trying to do that in good faith for months. But this bill, as written, with a $30,000 cap for those making under $400,000, is just woefully inadequate. And so, no, this does not have my support. It will not have my support. And if this bill comes to the floor for a vote, I will vote no. And so, it's incumbent on leadership and the administration, obviously, to negotiate with us in good faith and get to a number that adequately addresses the concerns that we have outlined.
So if 30,000 is not adequate for that number, Congressman, what is?
Look, I introduced a bill that would raise the cap to 100,000 for individuals, 200,000 for married couples. We had a discussion earlier today with leadership. I'm not going to get into the specific numbers, but suffice to say, it was made very clear that this number, as presented, is a hard no from all of us who have been negotiating on this from the beginning. And so, we will continue to work in good faith with leadership, with the administration, to get this done. But we need to have an honest and serious discussion about the issue. And thus far, that has not happened.
Well, Congressman, there's going to be some give and take in all of this. And what are you looking for others to perhaps give to get you to where you want to be? $100,000 may be a non-starter for some of your colleagues, but what would they be willing to give up to let you have a much higher level on SALT?
Remember, and I'll remind everyone, including my colleagues, if nothing passes, SALT comes back unlimited. Now, the problem would be you would have other provisions, including the alternative minimum tax that would come back, and the standard deduction would be cut in half. So it's incumbent on everybody to negotiate in good faith, which is why we've been willing to obviously continue with a cap on the full deductibility. But the fact is that SALT was a pay-for other provisions of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And so to somehow try to play both sides of this and say, well, it's a pay-for, but you have to pay for the pay-for, that's a joke. The fact is that putting a cap in place serves as a pay-for. So we don't have to find a dime for it. What we are putting in place with a cap helps pay for other provisions within the tax bill. We're simply asking for fairness as we negotiate this.
Well, what we saw released this afternoon does not include the increase in the top rate for the wealthiest earners. This is something that the president had gotten behind. Is that something you and your Republican colleagues are leaving perhaps in your hip pocket if you need to find savings to perhaps support an increase in the cap or other priorities by the party?
Look, obviously, this is a continuing negotiation, and there's a lot of things still left to be decided and discussed. And certainly, revenue is a key part of this bill, because the objective is to make sure that as we find savings in spending, that we're not adding to the deficit. And so, look, there's a lot of game left to be played here. We're going to negotiate in good faith and ultimately get a bill passed, because we have to. We need to get a bill passed that provides real tax relief to Americans all across this country. And that's why we are willing to negotiate on the issue of SALT. But, all of these other issues will work themselves out and, as we work through it and, make a final determination with respect to revenue and obviously taxes and savings.
Well, and when we consider where some of those savings are coming from, according to the Congressional Budget Office, the bill put forward by the Energy and Commerce Committee with its cuts to Medicaid would save more than the allotted $880 billion. But as a result, Congressman, the CBO estimates 13.7 million people will be kicked off the rolls over the next decade. Republican Senator Josh Hawley says that's politically suicidal. Can you stand for it?
Look, we are working through, obviously, the provisions that have been put out by the Energy and Commerce Committee. I have fought back tirelessly against, prospective changes, including lowering the FMAP floor, when it comes to the federal share for Medicaid, block grants, per capita caps, dish cuts. And so, where I have said I am open to is with respect to preventing illegal immigrants from receiving Medicaid benefits, to ensure that eligibility verification is sped up so that people who are not eligible do not remain on the program, and work requirements. The fact is, if you are an able-bodied adult without dependents, you should be working or in school or volunteering, et cetera. And so these are common sense reforms. We will work through, obviously, the top lines in terms of costs and the impacts. But I've been very clear, we are not kicking people who are eligible recipients off of the program. And so that is something, I fought back against per capita caps on the expansion population, for instance. So this is, we have been working tirelessly through this and will continue to do so as we work towards a final bill.
Congressman, in the minute we have left, what about the proposal to tax college endowments by up to 21%? That is likely to draw some objections from the academic community. How firm is that in the bill right now?
Well, I introduced legislation earlier this year to have a 10% endowment tax on endowments across the country. And the objective is really to make sure that they are actually spending their endowments on student affordability and not serving as just a hedge fund. If they want to operate as a hedge fund, then they're going to be taxed as such. But the fact is, they should be using these endowments to help reduce the college burden, the cost of college, on students. That is the objective of me and many of my colleagues in supporting an endowment tax. We'll see, obviously, as these numbers unfold in the markup, how that sticks. But at the end of the day, these universities and institutions should be using the endowment for the purpose of reducing the cost of college.
Republican Congressman Mike Lawler of New York, thank you. Coming up, the U.S. and China will temporarily lower tariffs on each other's products after this weekend's talks in Geneva. But what does that mean for trade relations going forward? We'll discuss it all with Caroline Freund, non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute, next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
China was the only country who escalated their tariffs in response to our reciprocal tariff level. So that resulted in an unfortunate escalation. So we now have a mechanism to deal with that. Neither side wants a generalized decoupling. The U.S. is going to do a strategic decoupling.
That was Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent this morning on Bloomberg Surveillance, shortly after we learned that the Trump administration and China agreed to a 90-day tariff truce. Bessent there discussing the U.S.'s plan for strategic decoupling with China as the two nations continue their trade negotiations. And joining us now for more here on Bloomberg TV and radio is Caroline Freund. She is non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute and dean of the UC San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategy. Caroline, thanks for being here on Balance of Power. When we consider where we started the weekend with the U.S. having a 145% tariff rate on all Chinese goods to now taking that down below 30%, 20%, knowing that China did take their tariffs down by an equal amount. Do you see the Trump administration as the one that really rolled here?
I think they both did. It was really unsustainable for both countries for different reasons. It was unsustainable for the U.S. because there's a lot of things we need from China. And it was unsustainable for China because they need to manufacture things and sell them. And the U.S. is a huge market. So both sides really had a lot of incentive to make a deal.
Caroline, we talk about a 90-day pause as unveiled by the Treasury Secretary and Jamieson Greer. Do we think that's going to be enough time to iron out all the details and write all that fine print?
No, it won't be enough time to iron out all the details. The question is whether it'll be enough time to iron out the important details. And I think it will. I think the U.S. saw what happened with the stock market, with the bond market, and with people's appetite for tariffs during this period of escalation and doesn't want a repeat of that. And for China's part, their economy is not strong. They're still under the pressure from the property market crisis. And they need to keep people working and in the factories. Youth unemployment is high. So both sides really have an incentive to get something tenable during this period.
But on that exact point, Caroline, the fact that China's economy is reliant on exports, they do need to continue to have the kind of manufacturing capacity they do. Does that not mean that the U.S. isn't going to get something ultimately that it really wants, which is less Chinese supply flooding the global market and keeping prices down?
Yeah, I think that we could move towards that if the administration focuses on the right things. And unfortunately, to date, we haven't seen that. So their focus has been on the trade deficit and specifically the bilateral trade deficit, when what they really should be pushing for is China to consume more, the people in China to consume more, so they don't need to export all that excess capacity, and the people in the United States to save more so we don't spend all our money on consuming goods from China and other places.
Caroline, we've talked a lot about what the U.S. administration wants out of this trade conversation with China, but what is Beijing looking for, and are they likely to get it? And what I'm thinking of specifically are some of the export controls that the Trump administration and its predecessor, the Biden administration, had imposed, for example, on semiconductors. Will there be any relief for China and its companies?
That's really hard to say. I think on the tariff side, China will get part of what it wants, which is market access, especially for non-strategic products where we don't want to be highly dependent on China. With respect to semiconductors, there are kind of two views. And one is holding back the supply to China has really helped to slow down the companies and AI there. On the other hand, as we've seen with DeepSeek, it also gives incentive for innovation to happen. When countries are under restriction, when we really don't know what drives incredibly talented people to innovate, and those kinds of restrictions could be pushing China to develop their own semiconductors faster, to figure out how to work with differently powered semiconductors. So I think there are two views, and it depends which one ends up dominating at the end of the day. The tech sector itself would certainly like to see an easing of those restrictions. They rely on exports to China, and those revenues from the exports go back into innovation in the U.S. So there's also that side as well. We kind of need market access there. So it really depends who dominates that discussion at the end of the day.
And Caroline, looking beyond the relationship between the world's two largest economies, the U.S. and China, what signal does this send to other U.S. trading partners that are right now locked in talks with the Trump administration?
I think what we've seen over and over again is the Trump administration blinking. So first it was Canada and Mexico. and the 25% tariffs there. Then they got removed on USMCA trade, which is frankly the vast bulk of trade, and anything can go through that agreement. And then we saw the blink on the reciprocal, or what I like to call trade deficit tariffs, because they certainly aren't reciprocal. They're based on bilateral trade deficits. We saw the blink with the 90 days there. And this is really the third one. So I think what people have learned is that this administration, there's a lot of uncertainty. They're unreliable, but there is market discipline. So at the end of the day, the market doesn't like what Trump is doing. He's going to back off.
All right, Caroline Freund, non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute. Thank you so much for joining us. And we want to mention some breaking news just crossing the Bloomberg terminal pertaining to Coinbase. It's set to join the S&P 500, will replace Discover Financial in the benchmark index effective on May 19th. And the anticipation of all of the buying of funds that track the index that could come with that is sending shares higher by more than 7% after hours. Again, Mike, Coinbase going to be joining the S&P 500 a week from today.
Up ahead, the stakes of the president's Mideast trip as several geopolitical conflicts continue to play out. We'll discuss more when former Defense Secretary Leon Panetta joins us. But up next, President Trump is attempting to slash drug prices for Americans by more closely aligning their costs to lower prices paid abroad. That would expand upon a failed push from his first term. And we'll discuss the impact of this executive order with Dwayne Wright of Bloomberg Intelligence next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. President Trump this morning signed an executive order that aims to lower drug prices. Let's get the latest from Dwayne Wright of Bloomberg Intelligence. Dwayne, we saw this order this morning, and it looked like a lot what we saw back in the first Trump administration. What is different this time, and will it stick? It sure didn't the last time around.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So the difference is this time there isn't necessarily a framework. He's proposing some other avenues to lower drug prices, bringing in pharma companies to basically hear the prices that the administration wants their drugs set at, and then giving them time over about 6 months to get to that level. And if that doesn't happen, there will be some additional regulatory measures. We didn't see them, or the specifics of those, but we can assume they're along the same lines of the last proposal. So thinking about a demonstration project through Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation, which it's worth noting that did not get struck down on its merits. It was for procedural reasons. Yeah. So really, let's think about how this is setting up a negotiation for the president to at least claim some kind of win at the end of the year.
All right, Dwayne Wright of Bloomberg Intelligence, thank you so much for joining us. And we'll have more straight ahead here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
We're going to do a lot of trade with Pakistan. We're going to do a lot of trade with India. We're negotiating with India right now. We're going to be soon negotiating with Pakistan. And we stopped the nuclear conflict. I think it could have been a bad nuclear war. It ends the only American citizen is captured and held hostage by Hamas since October 7th, 2023. And he's coming home to his parents, which is really great news. And starting today, the United States will no longer subsidize the health care of foreign countries. Europe's going to have to pay a little bit more. The rest of the world's going to have to pay a little bit more, and America's going to pay a lot less. Whatever the lowest price paid for a drug in other developed countries, that is the price that Americans will pay. And I think you may have a good result out of the Thursday meeting in Turkey between Russia and Ukraine. And I believe the two leaders were going to be there. I was thinking about flying over, but I would fly there if I thought it would be helpful.
That was President Donald Trump earlier today at the White House before leaving for the Middle East. It was a wide-ranging event. It covered everything from an executive order on drug prices to his willingness to personally attend peace talks between Russia and Ukraine later this week in Turkey. Joining us now for the latest from the White House is Bloomberg's Schuyler Woodhouse. Schuyler, thank you for joining us. And, Schuyler, is this trip really all about the deals? We heard the president talking about this so much, all the investment he wants to bring into the United States.
Look, Mike, there's so much going on right now in the world, and this trip it's President. Well, it's his second trip behind his Trump's trip to Rome for the Pope's funeral, but all eyes are on this trip. I mean, he was talking about a lot of things before heading to the White House. He has, made it very clear that he, wants to further discussions around Gaza. Now we have the Qatari jet that they are now offering to Trump, to the U.S. government, and that is sort of taking over the conversation on his trip to the Middle East. All eyes on if he's coming back with that jet or what that looks like. And now him potentially going to Turkey. I mean, he says he doesn't know where he will be, but we'll have to see if he actually ends up going there.
Well, and if he's adding Turkey to his itinerary, but decidedly not going to Israel, even as we saw the last living American hostage released by Hamas today, what does that signal, Tyler, about the president's relationship with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu?
I mean, look, the two of them, Netanyahu has been to the White House a few times now since the president took office in January. So, we like to think that, the two of them are talking and are on good terms. But this is sort of just the next step in what we will see in terms of, the Israel-U.S. relationship and what that means for Gaza.
All right. Bloomberg's Schuyler Woodhouse, thank you so much for joining us. Now, with President Trump still en route to the Middle East, we're watching another story today developing out of the region, as Schuyler was just telling us about. Hamas freeing the last living American hostage held in Gaza, Adon Alexander, following talks between the U.S. and the group ahead of President Trump's visit. And joining us now for a closer look at the implications of this here on Bloomberg TV and radio is Leon Panetta, former Secretary of Defense, former FBI Director, and, of course, former White House Chief of Staff as well. Mr. Secretary, always great to have you here on Balance of Power. When we consider the release of this hostage, this singular hostage, while obviously a very big deal for the country, for Adon Alexander's family, there are still dozens of hostages, either living or deceased, in Gaza that have yet to be returned. And I wonder what you think this means for a wider deal that could be struck and what the U.S.'s role is going to be in negotiating it if it's acting unilaterally right now.
Well, I think the real intent behind the U.S. and Hamas talking that resulted in the release of the last living American. Thank God. I think there were 12 that were taken. 5 were killed, but 7 were able to be freed. I think the real incentive here was to see if they could open the door to a restoration of the ceasefire, the more permanent ceasefire for Gaza, so that the remaining hostages could be released as well. I think there's something like 58 hostages still remaining. The estimate is that maybe a little over half of those are still alive. But I think the hope is that the ability to get a permanent ceasefire plus the release of the hostages could very well represent the end of that war. That, I think, is the hope of both Hamas and the United States.
Mr. Secretary, when it comes to questions about negotiations between the Trump administration and rivals and adversaries, we just saw over the weekend that there was a significant change in the tone between the U.S. and China, and the U.S. side indicating that they saw suddenly much greater prospects for some sort of agreement on trade with Beijing. What sort of signal does that send to adversaries in Moscow and in Tehran?
Well, it does show that the United States is bending over backward to try to see if they can establish better relationships here in order, I think, to promote either a better economy or peace. So I suspect that whether you're in Moscow or China or whether you're one of our adversaries in other parts of the world, that what this does is it kind of makes you want to consider what the United States might be willing to back off on in order to establish a better relationship.
Mr. Secretary, of course, in addition to your tenure as CIA director, you also were director of the Department of Defense. And according to President Trump, it's the Department of Defense that is actually receiving the gift from the government and the royal family of Qatar of a $400 million Boeing 747. And I wonder if you think that's an appropriate gift for a foreign government to be making to the United States, what role the Defense Department should be playing in making sure it's outfitted to serve as Air Force One, and just how that overall gift strikes you.
Well, besides constitutional questions that have been raised about the gift, I just think it sends a bad signal, particularly when, after all, these tariffs have been put in place for what reason? So that Americans would buy American. And here the president is going to get a gift from Qatar as a gift, rather than, frankly, pushing Boeing to complete the presentation of the new Air Force One. I just think it sends the wrong signals. I understand that the president would like to have a plane. That's understandable. But I think because of all these questions that are raised, particularly with this tariff war going on, particularly with the signals that have been sent, I think this is just a bad moment to receive a very expensive gift from a foreign country.
Mr. Secretary, the president may make an additional stop during this Mideast trip to Turkey, where he may, as he said this morning, join discussions on ending the war in Ukraine. And there is the prospect of Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky joining, but also Vladimir Putin. President Donald Trump is certainly hoping that he may show up to take part in these talks. How much is riding on this for Donald Trump?
Well, you know, as a former chief of staff to the president of the United States, I really think that the president ought not to undermine his impact when it comes to these kinds of negotiations, which means that if he's going to do things, he's got to have a strategy. Rather than just suddenly winding up in Turkey and not quite knowing how this is going to play out, I just think that's a dangerous gamble. What I would prefer to see is that the White House develops some very clear strategy as to what is possible, what they can achieve, and if it looks like they can't achieve it, then that's the time to deploy the president's good faith and credibility.
Mr. Secretary, the Trump administration has floated the prospect of additional sanctions against Russia if it does not really take the initiative on talks. Are we past the point, though, of sanctions against Russia being effective?
Well, you know, again, it's a question of our credibility. If we can't keep threatening Russia with sanctions and then not apply the sanctions, particularly when Russia turns its back on the peace process. I think the fact that Putin would not agree to some kind of ceasefire that Ukraine agreed to and that the United States was pushing, basically that was a moment in time when it made sense to start putting more pressure on Russia and increasing sanctions on Russia. So to now do it based on whatever discussions they try to have for peace, I just think, you know, there's only so many times you can point that weapon and not fire it.
Well, and to that point, on the idea of kind of being a boy who cried wolf, or like bluffing in some sense, Mr. Secretary, when we look at what just happened between the U.S. and China, all this big talk on keeping tariff levels high until you extract the behavior you want from an adversary, does that have any read-through into how Vladimir Putin may be looking at approaching the Trump administration, a suggestion that if he waits long enough, there may be a rolling over or a backing off?
Well, that is the danger that I think the administration has to give a lot of thought to, that it threatens tough steps, but then within a few months backs off of those tough steps in order, hopefully, to try to get some kind of agreement. But this on again, off again kind of approach to dealing with policy, whether it's tariffs or whether it's dealing with Russia or whether it's dealing with other countries. It basically sends a signal that the United States is difficult to rely on in terms of its word. And so I think the president has to be very clear that when he threatens something and when you say something's going to happen, there are times when you have to stick by your word. Otherwise, if you keep backing off of it, it really raises serious questions about credibility.
Leon Panetta, former Secretary of Defense and CIA Director, thank you. Coming up, the Trump administration is expected to accept a luxury Boeing jumbo jet from Qatar's royal family to be used as Air Force One. We'll discuss this lavish gift when we assemble our political panel next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I could be a stupid person to say, oh, no, we don't want a free plane. We give free things out. We'll take one, too. I think it's a great gesture from Qatar. I appreciate it very much. I would never be one to turn down that kind of an offer.
Do you plan to use the plane after you leave office?
No, I don't. No, it would go directly to the library after I leave office.
President Trump earlier today discussing the palace in the sky, a $400 million luxury jet that Qatar plans to gift to the administration to the United States as Air Force One. It would likely be the most valuable gift ever extended to the U.S. from a foreign government, and some Democrats are slamming the announcement, with Congressman Jamie Raskin of Maryland writing, quote, "The Constitution is perfectly clear. No present of any kind whatever from a foreign state without congressional permission. A gift you use for 4 years and then deposit in your library is still a gift and a grift." We should note President Trump, as we just heard, says he wouldn't be using the jet after leaving office and that this gift is actually to the Defense Department, not to him personally. But let's get into this now here on Bloomberg TV and radio and turn to our political panel. Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis, Stonecourt Capital partner and Republican strategist, alongside Democratic analyst Jeanne Zaino, senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Welcome to you both. Rick, of course, this news dropped just as President Trump is making a trip to Qatar and Saudi Arabia and the UAE. With a big foreign trip like that, is this really what he wants all of us talking about, the moral, legal, ethical questions around accepting this jet?
Look, we've had over 100 days of flooding the zone, and today was like even an exercise in flooding. I mean, there were probably 10 news stories coming out of the White House this morning, this being one of them, right before a foreign trip, which would be a news story all to itself in any other administration. And so I don't think he cares. I think his attitude is the more the merrier. We're not, seeing any kind of prioritization of the messaging. Talking about a gift from Qatar of a jumbo jet is exactly the same time commitment that he makes to, release of hostages in the Middle East or negotiating a truce between India and Pakistan. Any other days, those things would take precedence, but not in this administration.
Jeanne, is this starting to pile up at all for the president in terms of some of the political risk? We've seen a lot of questions about tariffs and the potential impact there on the economy. Is this just another drop in that flood Rick was just talking about?
It is, except I want to ask all of you, and Rick in particular, what about making things in America? Our children can't have dolls and pencils made overseas, but he can have an Air Force One jumbo jet. This is the height of hypocrisy, not to mention completely unconstitutional. Article 1, Section 9, Clause 8, the Emoluments Clause. What happened to Republicans as originalists and textualists? Read the text. It's very clear. There's been a time in the not so recent past when a gift of a watch would get somebody in big trouble if they didn't report it properly. And he is publicly saying he may accept something for $400 million. It is a bridge too far, not to mention insecure, unconstitutional, illegal, and a violation of his own Make Everything in America principle.
Well, I guess at the very least, if you had to pick one element of the duopoly, he picked Boeing versus, say, Airbus. But I guess we'll leave that one there. I do want to ask you, though, Jeanne, about, since you're joining us from New York, about the tax bill that was released by the House Ways and Means Committee today, which is going to raise the SALT cap, at least in the draft, to $30,000 up from $10,000. And for some, like Congressman Mike Lawler of New York, who joined us earlier this hour here on Balance of Power, that's not enough. This is what he said.
When the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act expires at the end of this year, SALT comes back unlimited. And so in order for there to be a tax bill that would actually put a cap in place, it has to adequately address the concerns of my constituents. This bill, as written, with a $30,000 cap for those making under $400,000, is just woefully inadequate. And so, no, this does not have my support.
He says he's a no. Jeanne, Nick LaLota says he is a, quote, hell no. There's also Congresswoman Elise Stefanik, who has been quiet on this today, but might have gubernatorial ambitions. Can any Republican in the New York delegation actually vote for this thing on the floor? And does that mean it'll go down?
You know, as it stands, probably not. And it was such a great conversation with Lawler because, to your point, he was very, very clear. No uncertain terms, no politicking. He is a hard no. I think for the SALT folks, they feel like the fact they're willing to accept a cap is a compromise on their side. And they want the leadership, they want their administration to meet them halfway. And they don't feel like the numbers they saw today are meeting them halfway or at all. And of course, they have the power because if nothing happens, this thing goes away. So for them, they are waiting for a conversation that they feel addresses their real needs. And, you know, I think we're seeing this on all ends. I was looking at a tweet from Chip Roy where he talked about his sort of red lines, if you will, and there were 4 of them, from completely repealing the IRA to meaningfully reducing the deficit. Mm-hmm. And while they're still working on this bill, they're not coming close to that at this point.
Rick, what does this all say about the bind that Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, finds himself in? He really doesn't have a lot of leeway, not nearly as much as his predecessor did back in 2017.
You know, I don't know. You think about what Representative Lawler, smart guy, maybe has statewide ambitions. What are your choices? I'm going to complain about an increase in the cap, or I can be part of the reason that you now have the largest tax increase in the history of America. I mean, those are the 2 options he has, right? He doesn't vote for the bill,
but then the SALT cap goes away. There is no cap.
The SALT cap goes away, but all the other taxes come piling on. And by the way, I don't know if you've done a side-by-side. I don't think it's a fair trade. And so the last thing Mike Lawler wants to be is the guy that walked down the aisle and voted no, and you got the biggest tax increase in American history. His corporations in the state and the people who pay that are going to be very upset with him, versus getting an increase in the cap. Now, to me, on a political basis, that's a no-brainer. I think everybody's positioned themselves. The very big, beautiful bill is going to have a lot of different moving parts, but there's no chance that the New York delegation is to walk down and vote yes if the option is tanking the entire bill, which, by the way, will probably have a deficit increase associated with it, and so they'd be shutting down government.
We just have a minute left, and I want to hit you both on this. Rick, do you think there's still a chance this thing can pass by Memorial Day?
No.
Jeanne, do you? Because that's what the Speaker wants.
Not by Memorial Day. Another holiday soon after, maybe, but not Memorial Day.
Okay, well, then maybe we look to the 4th of July,
Rick
Mike.
Davis and Jeanne Zaino, thank you very much for joining. Coming up, April CPI is due, and we'll preview the data next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Bloomberg's Michael Shepard, I'm Kaylee Lines. And we're looking ahead to tomorrow morning, where April CPI data will be released. All eyes will be on it. We're expecting, Mike, a 0.3% increase month on month on both the headline and core measure. My question is going to be, what ultimately will the print do to expectations around Fed rate cuts? Because we have seen those expectations actually getting taken down today in the aftermath of the positive news out of the U.S. and China.
That's right, Kaylee. One of the things that Fed Chair Jerome Powell last week alluded to, he didn't say outright tariffs were responsible for perhaps more inflationary pressure and also more recession pressure. We'll be looking for that to see if we see any signals of that, especially in certain categories of goods.
Yeah, although the Fed Governor Adriana Kugler did say today, you're still likely to see higher prices and lower growth, even with tariff rates lowered, as they have been, at least for 90 days. I guess it's a question of whether or not the stagflationary pressures are lessened enough that the Fed doesn't feel the need to move off the block.
And those new tariff levels only take effect later this week and for a 90-day period, too.
Yes, very good point. We'll have more on this tomorrow. In the meantime, check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online, and we'll see you back here for more on not just the CPI data, but President Trump's trip to the Middle East. Remember, he's on Air Force One right now. So we'll see you for the Tuesday edition right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.